Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill and I'm back out in the vegetable garden. You know, I teach a lot of classes about raised bed gardening. I've written columns on raised bed gardening, but I suddenly realized I've never done a video about it. So today we're going to talk about how wonderful raised bed gardening is. We have 26 raised beds in our garden. In it we grow all kinds of veggies, herbs, and also small fruits. And I am absolutely sold on them. I first learned about raised bed gardening way back in 1981 when I read a magazine article about it. And I thought, I want to give that a try because they look so productive. And I have to tell you, yes, they are. Now, most of our beds are 3 feet wide by 8 feet long. It was just a size we decided to start out with. We also have 2 beds that are 3 feet wide by 16 feet long. That's where we grow our raspberries. And then a few years ago, we built some larger beds that are 4 feet wide by 16 feet long, and that's for other types of vegetables. So let's look at the different attributes of raised bed gardening that make them so terrific. First and foremost, the soil in the raised beds stays loose, and that's because you're walking around the beds and not across them or right up to the plants that are growing. You might not know this, but the #1 reason that plants fail to thrive is root compaction. And so growing in a framed raised bed like what we're doing makes all the difference. And of course, root crops do beautifully in raised beds because they can push down through the soil very easily and develop really nice roots. So this is one of our carrot beds, and they are doing great. If you live in an area where it's very rocky or maybe the soil doesn't drain well, all you do is build yourself a raised bed, set it down, fill it with some soil and organic amendments, and boom, you've got a garden that solves those problems. The soil warms up earlier in the spring because the sun isn't just hitting the tops of the beds, it's actually hitting the sides as well, and so a lot of times you can plant earlier than usual. One of the things I really like is that there's way less weeding. That is, if you do what we've done. All of our pathways have heavy-duty weed block fabric, which is also known as landscape fabric, underneath a few inches of bark mulch. Because of this, I only have to weed the tops of the beds, which is a huge time saver. Another thing I like about raised beds is that you can plant them more intensively. Now this is our corn patch. It's looking a little sad because everything has been harvested and the stalks are starting to die. But I want to use this as an example, and I've used it as an example in the past, but I want to emphasize this point. Conventional spacing for growing corn is where you have the plants roughly 18 to 24 inches apart in each row, and then the rows are 3 feet apart. I plant my corn a foot apart in all directions, and it grows beautifully. So this is a perfect example of intensive planting. What size beds should you build? Raised beds can be any size or shape you want, as long as you can reach across them without having to lean on, kneel on, or step on the beds. That way you won't compact the soil. As I mentioned earlier, our beds are 3 to 4 feet wide. I wouldn't go any wider than 4 feet. We've been happiest with 10-inch tall beds, but they can be as tall as you want. Let's talk about materials for building the beds. It's important to avoid using treated wood. That's because those chemicals can leach out of the wood and into the soil. If that happens, the roots of your plants can absorb those chemicals. And I don't know about you, but that's not why I grow my own veggies. I want them to be safe and healthy. We use regular lumber such as fir, pine, or larch. You can also use cedar or redwood, which weathers really well, but that's more expensive, so it just depends on your budget. Our beds are made with 2 by 10 lumber. Ages ago, we started out with 1 by 6 fence boards, and 1-inch thickness is just not sturdy enough. How long do our beds last? Ours average about 10 to 12 years, which I think is very good. When you assemble your raised beds, I heartily recommend using 4-inch long decking screws. That's because the screws will hold onto the wood much better than nails, which have a tendency to pop out of the seams, and you certainly don't want that. There are 5 per corner, although actually you can't see the bottom screw in this image. The other thing people always ask me is, where did you get all of the soil for your beds? Now I realize this won't apply to everyone's situation, but what we did is we knew we were going to be putting down the weed block fabric and a few inches of bark mulch. And we didn't want all of that material up against the wood because that could accelerate rotting. And so what we did is we took a spade and we scraped off the top 2 to 3 inches of our beautiful topsoil all around the beds, and then we put that inside the beds. Once we added in a little bit of organic amendments such as shredded leaves or compost, we had full beds, and that worked great. Let's talk about watering raised beds. And I want to show you first what we're using, and then I'll give you another alternative. So this is a drip irrigation system that my husband put together years ago, and it's fabulous. Every single bed is controlled by a valve, and this allows me to control the water flow to the beds. You know, there are certain vegetables that have different watering requirements, and so this way I can control it, which is perfect. But it's even better because let's say I'm growing onions in this bed and they need to dry out at the end of the season. I can just turn this valve completely off and they will dry beautifully. So I just love that. Now this is called drip tape. It's kind of a wide, flat type of drip irrigation tubing, and it has openings every few inches. Now, the alternative would be to use soaker hoses on your beds. And I love anything that keeps the water right on the surface of the soil rather than watering pathways, because that's a waste of water. And the surface of the soil is right where the plants want the water to be, right where the roots are. So that's really good. But another thing that would be a tremendous time saver for you would be to get a battery-operated timer that you put on your hose bib, and so this way you don't have to come out and hand water the beds or turn on the soaker hose. They're pretty inexpensive and you can find them at home stores everywhere. Now, vertical gardening is a great way to maximize your growing space, no matter what kind of a garden you have, but especially with raised beds. You've probably seen this pole bean arbor in previous videos, but I have to talk about it again because it is so slick. What's under all of this is actually 4 small arbors, and they are on either side of a pathway between 2 raised beds. The pole beans grow up and over this arbor, and the beans hang down on the inside, making it very easy for me to pick them, and I get to stand in the shade. Now we use other types of plant supports, so let me show you those. Now you've seen this summer squash bed before, but what we're using to support a vining type of zucchini called Trombetta di Albenga is a sheet of 4 feet wide by 8 feet long concrete reinforcing wire, and I'm using some old pieces of metal conduit as the support for it, and so I'm just tying up these vines against this grid to support the plants so they're up and off of the ground. In our tomato patch, we're using 2 sheets of that concrete reinforcing wire, and because tomato plants can get kind of heavy as they start producing, I'm using really heavy-duty metal fence posts to support them. Now this one is probably a little hard to see, and that's why I'm standing behind it. This is just a small decorative trellis that I bought at a garden center, and I use it to grow peas on. And of course the peas are done for the season, so that's why there's nothing on here. But these are ideal for doing some vertical gardening in your raised beds. Now you've probably been wondering what those upright pieces of PVC are on the outsides of our beds. And I wanted to explain that we've put them on almost all of our raised beds for the purpose of holding hoops. We took some old black plastic sprinkler pipe and we used them as hoops over beds where I need to put maybe bird netting or floating row cover to either give plants a little extra frost protection or to act as a physical barrier against some types of insects that the plants are susceptible to. This works great rather than having to push these into the soil. It's much sturdier. You are now an expert on raised bed gardening, but if you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop me a note at susan@susansinthegarden.com. Thanks for watching and happy gardening.